got a clicker here. Everyone hear me okay? Thank you very much, James. Thank you, Connected Data London, for having me here. I feel humbled to be in such a distinguished company. As James said, work for Electronic Arts. You may have heard of us. We make video games. Video games so meta, we even have video game characters playing video games within video games. I have a long-standing interest in linked data, dates back to the mid-2000s, and coming from a search background that was largely predicated on structured data. So when schema.org came out, I've been kind of keeping an eagle eye on it since I run the semantic search marketing community on Google+, soon to migrate with the platform, but join us there. It'll continue to be a thing. I keep this incredibly attractive spreadsheet, which documents the search engine support for structured data over the course of time, going back to 2009. And these days, it's kind of all schema.org all the time. And my big contribution to vocabulary development was that I suggested the term website, which wasn't in the initial release and now used probably on millions of sites due to a very specific Google requirement. So when schema.org came out on June 2nd, 2011, announced jointly by the search engines, I had my hot take up and running on June 3rd. And it's interesting because I wondered aloud in this post the question that we're discussing today. Would the introduction of schema.org start to bring linked data into the mainstream? Would it start bringing us more toward the promise of a web of linked data? And some 7 years later, I think we can start to assess that. Very brief history of the vocabulary. And by the way, as usual, I have more slides than time, so I'll be whipping through some of these, but you can see any of the exciting details online. Obviously not the first structured data vocabulary on the web. Both 2000, developed by Libby Miller and Dan Brickley. Dan Brickley then going on to run operations for schema.org on behalf of Google, DCMI terms, good relations, all great expressive vocabularies in their various domains, but they were never actually accorded with official search engine support. You didn't get any special benefit in search by using these. To a certain degree, Bing embraced Open Graph Protocol, which of course is primarily used for Facebook. And in 2009, Google, without any fanfare, I made up that logo. There is no logo for datavocabulary.org. It just kind of materialized. But it was kind of the shot across the bow in a lot of ways for this type of structured data because it was meant specifically to accommodate microdata and RDFA. So the only kind of vocabulary or system with long-standing support, microformats, various kind of degrees of support over the years from the search engines, not always well documented, but kind of the most stable thing we had until 2011 with the introduction of schema.org. Hopefully you have a passing familiarity with the vocabulary. It consists of a collection of schemas, unsurprisingly, organized into types, classes in a classical ontology. Properties rather than attributes and relations per se, because properties can often take either, in schema.org, either an attribute of an expected data type or a member of a named class, and you also have enumerations, which are predefined property values. As I said, this was launched initially with the support of Bing, Google, and Yahoo, soon followed by Yandex. So with the exception of Baidu, really embraced by all of the world's leading search engines. When it first came out, microdata and RDFA was supported. Google et al. Heavily supporting microdata. Caused some contentious back and forth. Eventually that settled down. RDFA Lite was supported. And later on, as it became available, JSON-LD, of which I'll have much to say later. So how has adoption looked? What I'm using here is Web Data Commons data from Common Crawl. It's a structured data extract of a sampling of websites. There's methodological issues with this. It's not an apples-to-apples comparison over time because they sample different websites, but each of the crawls contains between 12 and 40 million domains, so I think it's fairly representative. Haven't seen too much in the growth of RDFA over time, and that's mostly in the form of Open Graph Protocol. But as soon as schema.org came into being, use of microdata skyrocketed. And as soon as JSON-LD came on the scene, they just started tracking that in 2015. Also a very steep trajectory. It wouldn't surprise me if JSON-LD surpasses microdata sometime soon. Can we be sure that this is actually a proxy for schema.org use? Yes. If you look at the classes for microdata, 19 out of the 20 top classes are schema.org. Datavocabulary.org, breadcrumbs, one of the last data types to be migrated by Google. And for JSON-LD, it's schema.org all the way down, all top 20 classes from schema.org. So those formats are, I think, very representative of use of the vocabulary. And for the first time, we finally see these formats with microdata finally overtaking HCARD in terms of popularity, with JSON-LD not too far behind. But even those raw numbers belie the fact that microformats aren't particularly expressive. It's not a very large vocabulary. And HCARD in particular has been encoded on a lot of popular blogging platforms like WordPress. There's my own blog. And that's most of the breadth of the assertions that you get there is an author URL and name. So yes, widely used, but not very expressive, which is not the case with schema.org. Other numbers, again, methodologically, some of these are pretty opaque. Marcus earlier said 31%. In aggregate, let's say between a quarter and 30% of sites on the web, and citing Marcus's 2 billion websites, that equals 600 million domains. That's pretty big. So I think provisionally we can say that schema.org, at least in the aspect of getting annotated linked data on the web, has been very successful indeed. I think there are other aspects of the vocabulary that are also interesting and successful, but that seems to have worked. Why is that? The biggest reason, I think, is that the search engines provided a clear value proposition for people to use the vocabulary in the form of rich snippets, what Google now calls rich results. So you take data directly from the structured data markup and populate search results with that, and that results in anything from a 15 to 75% lift in click-throughs for web publishers. So obviously a lot of incentive there. So you see product here where you get things like the price and the rating and what availability events where you get the date and the venue. Recipes where you have pretty explicit data about all sorts of things, ingredients, cooking time, calories, again, all powered by structured data markup. Since schema.org was released, the vocabulary has continued to develop, and you see continued use of that to populate rich results. Google now uses schema.org as a publisher. You can specify your logo or the social media accounts that you use. More recently, job postings, pretty major initiative from Google. Relies on the schema.org job posting type. And interestingly, and you see this more and more, a lot of schema.org development is use case driven by the search engine. So job posting went live as an actual service in Google while the vocabulary was still in pending. And more recently still, claim review, which fuels fact checks on the web. So it's a living vocabulary. If you look at these dates, that's a year apart. And I think that that's another reason for Schema's success, is that it continues to build expressiveness over the course of time. When it was launched, we saw about 300 classes. By November 2015, that had grown to over 600 classes in schema.org. By the way, very difficult to do an apples-to-apples properties comparison, so I've skipped that. And November 2018, today, just under around 600 in core. You see that deplete because since then there's been an extension mechanism and many of the core terms have moved to extensions. And then pending the kind of queuing function of schema.org sees a large number of classes. So it's an evolving vocabulary, and that you can start to ideate use cases that then potentially can be taken up by the vocabulary, I think is pretty important, and certainly not typical of user experiences prior to schema.org, where often you see a vocabulary minted and done, or if it was developed, it was pretty opaque, the process by which new additions or changes were made. Schema.org has a community development process. Originally, the locus of this was the schema.org mailing list. Public Vocabs now has got its own. But really the killer app in terms of vocabulary development has been the integration of GitHub into schema.org. Most developers familiar with the platform, and rather easier to work with than the circa 1995 W3C mailing list in terms of organizing conversations and keeping the ball rolling. And then finally, schema.org will work directly with partners, especially in developing specialist vocabulary. They integrated good relations, working with Martin Hepp, working with the International Press Telecommunications Council. They integrated RNews. Early on, they partnered with a number of medical organizations, like Harvard, to build out the health and life sciences vocabulary, now in its own extension. And very recently, they've been working, schema.org has been working closely with the Trust Project in terms of supporting claim review for fact checks on the web and other trust indicators for news organizations. The extension utility of schema.org initially was pretty fuzzy. They kind of basically expected webmasters to try things out and maybe it would be adopted, and nobody did. So this completely revamped in 2.0, and there are two sorts of extensions. One, hosted extensions that take a bit of the schema.org namespace, things like bib.schema.org, which is a vocabulary for automobiles, but they essentially work the same way as core terms because the canonical URL for that is schema.org rather than the subdomain. But there's also now a mechanism by which any individual organization can extend the vocabulary with their own extensions called an external extension. And the first big example of this is GS1. They're the organization that provides barcodes to the world, and they've developed a smart search a web vocabulary standard that powers their smart search product, which allows them to be a lot more expressive about products and services that are important in the GS1 environment. And you can see, with properties like cheese firmness, there are things that do not belong in the core. But it is important to those who make cheese. So you can see the utility of that sort of extension. There's actually in place, Tesco uses GS1. So this very plain landing page for Scottish shortbread fingers behind the scenes is marked up with all sorts of information about the product, things like allergen alerts and recipe ingredients. Going back, there's really not a lot to mark up on that page in the presentation layer. So if you're trying to do that in microdata or RDFA, you'd be using a lot of meta tags pointlessly. So this is JSON-LD, and I think that that's been another propelling force towards the adoption of schema.org. In 2014, I sat down to interview Greg Kellogg about JSON-LD. Phil Archer joined us for that conversation, at that time W3C activity lead, now with GS1. And he pointed out that the great thing about JSON-LD isn't the LD part, it's the JSON part, right? That it's a format that developers were intimately comfortable working with on a day-to-day basis. And to extend the drug analogy, whether or not they knew that they were using linked data, they were actually injecting linked data into the ecosystem very directly. So JSON-LD has proved to be an enormous success in terms of supporting syntax for the vocabulary. And just a brief example of this, pretty typical situation. You redesign an e-commerce site, you have to move all the elements around. If you're trying to rejig that with microdata or RDFA, you have to make sure all your span and div tags close correctly. It's just a mess and a nightmare. I remember Dwayne Forrester, at that time Webmaster Trends analyst, thank you, for Bing, said that I can't remember if it was the majority or a large minority, like 30, 40% of markup was invalid that Bing was ingesting. So I think JSON-LD goes a long way in correcting that. In any case, presentation layer doesn't matter. JSON-LD is still the same behind the code because it describes the entities and their properties behind the scenes. So you can make presentation layer changes without affecting the underlying data. All fine and well, been a big success in search. We have those value propositions, but interestingly enough, schema.org has started to extend its reach beyond search. Some of these applications, and I think this was mentioned before by you, Marcus, Pinterest, for example, uses schema.org in a very search engine fashion, pulling the title and the image and the price you see there pulled from schema.org data. But it's really when you have a vocabulary that's been well vetted, is strikes the right balance between expressivity and complexity, it starts to become useful when you need vocabulary for some other purpose. So Google Assistant, when they got into the speaker business, needed a way of marking, having a system for voice communication, and schema.org obviously was the likeliest candidate for this. So you can have your Google Home, I'm not sure if you've ever tried this, but read you step-by-step recipe instructions, and that's fueled entirely by schema.org recipe markup. And in fact, you don't need to do anything special as a webmaster in order to have recipe results eligible for use with the Google Assistant. Just by encoding them in that fashion, you get that benefit. More recently, speakable specification allows news publishers in particular to specify which parts of an article should be read out by a Google Assistant when you ask for a news query. And by the way, another example of a pending schema.org class that Google's already started to employ because of its use case. But Google, not the only smart speaker in town. You also have Alexa. And guess what? When they needed an ontology for their speaker, they used schema.org. What does that mean, Chance?
Oh, a minute.
OK, thank you. You see, yeah, we're number one. Just a couple of quick examples here. Southern Cross used schema.org to bootstrap their ontology. You have a proof of concept knowledge graph for biodiversity. Use schema.org for its base ontology. Sure, that's a little knowledge graph. What about big ones? Here's Baidu, the Chinese search engine. If you look at these classes, you'll immediately recognize schema.org, and indeed, they said that that was what it was based on. And I can attest to the fact that EA, when we needed a vocabulary to develop our content ontology, we turned to schema.org because it had most of the things that were important to us in that ecosystem: video games, websites, media objects like videos and images. But a counter argument to that is that schema.org actually isn't expressive enough, that because it was built by and for the search engines, it was too far in the commercial domain. It didn't cover enough use cases. I know we're low on time, but I started late, so let me work through this. Is this true? Let's verify this by playing 20 questions. What can you answer with schema.org using these questions? Is it an animal? No, you can just say it's a thing, unless Fluffy here is sold in a pet store or a butcher shop. Is it a vegetable? You can't say really anything besides it's a thing unless it's sold at Whole Foods. Is it a mineral? Not unless you make a product out of it. So schema.org isn't that expressive when it goes beyond those commercial domains, but one of the changes that I've noticed over the past couple of years with schema.org is people are far more open to developing the vocabulary in broader ways. So this thread has been rekindled of late to add animal terminology and actually plant terminology along with this. And if that ever comes to be, we can finally say that Fluffy eats Fluffy eats carrots. And just very quickly, we reinvent in order to simplify. So yes, there are external vocabularies that you could map these terms to, but the issue with that is that likely a lot of webmasters wouldn't use them, and also it starts to degrade that value proposition of deriving benefit from the vocabulary. Very quickly, Gary Isles from Google said, "I'd like to see a world without structured data." That the web should be more populated by intelligent AI processes that go and crawl the web and figure these things out on their own rather than the webmasters marking them up. But there are some cases where the lack of semantics for some objects makes schema.org a really good choice. Dataset search is a really good example. Not sure what you can tell by that table. What it refers to is actually about cats, and that's provided by schema.org markup. Google is using schema.org to specify how user media events are initiated directly from the search results. Fact checked. They've created a markup tool where no coding is required, where a fact checker can go and enter that information directly into the tool, and it's pushed into a repository on datacommons.org. By the way, the claim here is Paul McCartney's "I play the trumpet." This phrase mostly false. And then finally, almost done here, The last sort of a looming issue for schema.org are questions of identity in terms of dereferencing entity identifiers. Steve Macbeth, one of the steering group members from Bing, said that the time has come to looking at IDs. I was talking to Dan Brickley the other day, and channeling Gua, he said that schema.org, unlike kind of traditional linked data where the insistence is upon consensus upon entity identifiers and allowing for where it's chaotic diversity in terms of terminology, that with schema.org it's the other way around, that it's meant to align people on vocabulary and then allowing for a certain diversity within identifiers. If those two were ever to merge, I think that it might even be more powerful than we've seen it being. Thank you very much.
Big thanks to Aaron, and apologies for the rush, Aaron.
No worries.
There is no rush. So we've got the 5-minute buffer still, so we've got time for questions. Any questions back here?
Might as well make a joke. Rabbits don't eat carrots. They only eat the leaves. Only Bugs Bunny eats carrots.
See, you can maybe one day you'll be able to make that assertion using structured data.
Did I catch it correctly that at Electronic Arts you are kind of having your own graph that you based on schema.org but extended to your domain?
Exactly so.
Are you using it really just for marketing and SEO, or do you see also being used using that in driving games and adding intelligence into actual video games?
Time will tell. Currently, it's used primarily as the basis for our content graph, so being able to provide information to our players in different environments, and increasingly in order to personalize content by knowing what it's about and being able to match it to players' interests. But certainly, in terms of integrating that into the games directly, time will tell.
Okay, thanks.
Thanks very much for the talk. In terms of extending schema.org, as you guys have done, that's pretty interesting for internal stuff. We do the same at the BBC. We have our ontology that...
We looked a lot at the BBC with our work.
Exactly. So that's my question. So what happens when it turns from being an internal thing to when it's time to open up this data? Is it a good thing that you have all these different ontologies that look alike, but were initially extended? Like you've got creative works, you've got a few other things that we have as well that almost mean the same thing, just written by different companies. And then when we expose ours and you expose yours, is that all that duplication, is that a problem, or is that a good thing?
No, it's not a good thing, because these terms should, if you're talking about the same things, you should use the same terminology. And that's why, the extension mechanism now at schema.org is better than it was. And I think the more in which you can make a case for having a hosted versus an external extension, the better it is, because then that vocabulary becomes shared. Other than that, with external extensions, on the other hand, at least you can open that up. So GS1's smart search vocabulary is available on the web. Yours is. I'm trying to get some of ours up. And in terms of vocabulary development, I chair the community interest group on video games for extending video games. And what's obviously better than us at EA bumbling through and coming up with our own extensions is to work collaboratively with others in the industry. That's going to make it much more robust.
Got time for very quick question.
Maybe it's not too short. I was going to ask you something about the Google Structured Data tool, which is, at least for me, people in my team, is the main way to check whether our schema.org markup is good enough, to understand what Google does with it. And so the question is about the extensions you have to make to schema.org, maybe because it's something very specific to your domain. And if you put that metadata into your schema.org snippet and you pass it to the Google Structured Data tool, it complains about it.
It sure will.
So we don't really know whether that's a good thing or a bad thing, whether we should strip out those extra tags, knowing that maybe other people, not Google, or other people may consume it and find it useful. So is that detrimental to the discoverability aspect?
No,
of our
simply
metadata?
because you get the structured data testing tool complaining doesn't mean that it's neither invalid syntax nor that it's not necessarily interesting and good vocabulary, right? It just means that Google doesn't understand it. So certainly I wouldn't worry, and I've seen schema.org and additional structured data used in all sorts of circumstances that cause the SDDD to complain, and don't worry about it. Yeah.
Good to know. Thanks.
Great, and big thank you. Round of applause for
Thanks,
Aaron.
everyone.
Great talk.